All right, let's go on now with 9.4a here. And we're talking about completing the square. So solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So sometimes you run into a situation where you can't factor. We've seen a couple of those. And this one just kind of gives you another strategy which you can use to solve the equation if you can't factor. Maybe you can complete the square and then you can factor it. So that's the idea. So far what we know is for finding solutions, so we're going to kind of dealing with finding the square root, completing the square, stuff like that. So far how we've solved quadratics is by factoring, and we also did graphing. We've already done those, check and check. And there's two more ways in which we can solve. One is completing the square, which we can talk about today, and then we've got the quadratic formula, which is if all else fails, you can always use the quadratic formula to solve. Okay? And we'll get to that in 9.5. So let's move on. Completing the square. So what we do in completing the square is very similar to vertex form. So what we did in 9.3b, we're kind of doing the same thing here, is very similar to moving standard form to vertex form. Okay? So, and what we're basically talking about here is it's a method used to solve a quadratic equation which turns a trinomial into a perfect square binomial. Make sure we fix that. Turns it into a perfect square binomial. Okay? Which is kind of what we did in vertex form. And of course, by doing so, what we're actually doing is we're using that factoring shortcut because we know it's going to be a perfect square binomial, so we can use that factoring shortcut there. Remember, a trinomial has 3 terms. The binomial is going to have only 2. Right? So let's take a look at this one. So basically what we're doing is we're going to, remember we already got it as y equals. It can be 0 equals, but we're going to take that y equals. And we're actually going to scooch that 25. Remember, we're going to get that out of the way. So essentially what we're doing is we're going to take half of b, or half of b squared. Okay, so basically what we're doing is we're taking negative 10, dividing it by 2, because that's our b value, right? And then you're going to get negative 5, and we're going to square that to get 25. And remember, then what we're doing is we're adding the 25 inside the parentheses, and then outside the parentheses, we're subtracting that 25, because we have to be able to do balance it out on the other side. So essentially what we have here now is you're going to have y equals, and you're going to have your variable x, and then your half of b, which was minus 5 down here, squared. Okay? In this case, we can take a look and see that in this example, our positive 25 and our negative 25 are going to cancel each other out to be 0. That's not always going to be the case, and we'll have to do some other things with it. Like y equals x minus 5 squared would be our answer. Remember, your answer in the parentheses, the factoring shortcut here.
Cody Olet, please report to the main office. Cody Olet to the main office, please. Thank you.
So your x value is going to be your variable, and then this number here is your half of b. That's always going to be the case for your factoring shortcut. You can put your variable there, and then your half of b in there, and that'll be your answer. Okay? Okay, so let's get to how we take steps to complete the square. And like I said, this will feel like putting an equation in vertex form. So the first thing we want to do is we want to write the quadratic in standard form and find your a, b, and c. Okay? And the only thing that's different here is you make it so it's equal to 0, or it could equal y. It doesn't matter. Or equal to y. Either one of those is good to start out. Because eventually we're going to solve, and when we solve, we set it equal to 0. And but we'll get to that in a second. So make sure we got the quadratic formula, or excuse me, not the quadratic in standard form, and then find a, b, and c. Again, we're scooching c over and put parentheses around the first half of the problem, just like we did in section 9.3b. Then we're going to take the first half of b and square it. And I'm going fast here, so if you need to pause it, please do and stop it. But this is very similar to what we did in section 9.3b. and then add this value inside the parentheses, subtract it outside the parentheses. So it's exactly what we did when we moved from standard form to vertex form. And then finally, the last thing is we're going to write that trinomial as a perfect square binomial, and that is our factoring shortcut, if you remember. Factoring shortcut, because we know it's going to be a perfect square binomial. That's why the title is, my goodness.
Jordan.
Sorry about that. So that's our factoring shortcut. Remember, the name of the section is completing the square. So the stuff we did with dividing b by 2 and squaring it, you're actually completing it into a perfect square trinomial to make it so we can make it a perfect square binomial. So our factoring shortcut, remember, the first part of the parenthesis is going to be your variable, and the second part of your parenthesis is going to be your 1/2 of your b value. And then, of course, we're going to square that, right? Okay. So let's get to some examples and see how it goes. All right, this one, the example is they're not asking us to solve it. They're actually not asking us to even complete the square. They're just saying what value of c makes the trinomial a perfect square. So to make it a perfect square trinomial, then we can factor it into a perfect square binomial. All we have to do is find out what value of c here does that for us. So how do we do that? Oh my goodness. Sorry about that. Again, how many announcements can we have today? All right, so let's have, how do we figure out what number goes there? So basically we're going to take half of our b value, which in this case is -12, okay, and we're going to multiply by 1/2 or divide by 2, either way it's the same thing, and then you take -6, then you're going to square that, and that gives us 36. So this plus 36 here would actually be what makes it a perfect square. And so then I can factor it to my factoring shortcut, variable x, 1/2 of b value -6 squared. Okay? So 36 is the value of c that makes it a perfect square. All right, let's do another one. Example 2. Here we're actually completing the square. So we're doing everything but solving here. So y equals x squared plus 6x plus 15. So we're in good shape here. So what I want to do is I want to complete the square. So it's already in y equals form, so I'm going to put parentheses. I want to basically take this part here in parentheses and use that to complete the square. So I'm going to scooch that 15 away. So I'm going to go y equals x squared plus 6x. And then I'm going to scooch that 15 out of the way here because I know that somewhere here I'm going to have to add a value, and then over here I'm going to subtract that same value. And I'm going to use parentheses around the first part because I'm adding something here and subtracting it on the outside. And what am I adding and subtracting? That's my 1/2 of my b. So I can either divide it by 2 or take 1/2 times 6 in this case, which gives us 3. And when I square it, 3 squared equals 9. So I'm adding 9 inside the parentheses, and out here I'm subtracting 9 because I have to balance it out. I can't just take 9 things, just create 9 things. If I gave you 9 pieces of candy, then I took all 9 pieces away, then we're back to where we started. Nothing changed, right? Except maybe now you're mad at me because I took all your candy. All right, so now we go and we can factor the part in parentheses. And remember, that's where our shortcut comes in because it's going to be a perfect square binomial now. And remember, inside, that's your factoring shortcut. Inside, you've got variable, which is x, and then your 1/2 of b, which is 3 in this case. It would be a positive 3 squared. And then outside here, I got 15 minus 9, which gives us 6. And that's all I can really do right now in completing the square. And they're not asking me to solve. If they ask me to solve, all I would do here is plug a 0 in where y is. And then we can solve from there, which we're going to do next. But you just substitute that 0 in for y, and then we can solve. And we'll show you those steps next. So now let's finish the problem by solving. So we're going to make sure the equation is equal to 0. That's what we did in the last step. Isolate the parentheses. That's a fancy way of saying we want to get the parenthesis by itself. Remember over here we had this 6. Okay, so we'd have to subtract the 6 and bring it to the other side because we want to get the parenthesis all by itself. So make sure it's equal to 0, isolate the parentheses, then take the square root of both sides of the equation. Remember, that's going to get rid of the squared part of your binomial. But be careful over here because, remember we talked about this a while ago, square roots have 2 answers. You've got a positive value and a negative value because a positive times a positive is a positive, and a negative times a negative is a positive. So be careful about that. So you'll have 2 different answers there. And once you have those 2 answers there, then you're going to solve for the variable. And we know how to do that. That's your basic algebra stuff. Okay? So let's do an example of solving. Okay, so first thing, is it equal to 0 or equal to y? Yep, it's equal to 0 here, so we're in good shape. I'm going to go ahead and list my a's, b's, and c's. What's my a? What's my b? What's my c? Okay, good. And now I'm going to go ahead and complete the square. So the first thing I'm going to do, and we notice again, I just pointed out, we're equal to 0, so we're in good shape there. If it was a y, no big deal, we could substitute that. Okay, so I'm going to take my c squared minus 6c, and I'm going to scooch that negative 7 over to give it some room, and then it's equal to 0. Don't forget that equals 0 part. Now in parentheses, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take my b value, which is negative 6. Then again, I can do it 2 ways. I can multiply by 1/2 or I can divide by 2. They are the same thing. Multiplying by 2 and dividing by half are the same. Multiplying by 1/2 and dividing by 2 are the same thing. All right? Again, I'm going to say that again because I screwed it up. Multiplying by 1/2 or dividing by 2 is the same thing. So we've done it a couple different ways. So negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. When we square that, we get a positive 9. Notice when you square it, it's always going to be positive because negative times negative is positive, positive times positive is positive. So now I've got a 9. I can add that inside the parenthesis. I'm going to subtract it out here, outside the parenthesis. Remember, now I can use my factoring shortcut, which is going to make this variable c, and then my half of b value is right here, actually, c minus 3 squared. And then don't forget over here, I've got a negative 7 and a negative 9, which is going to add to make a negative 16 equals 0. Okay? So the next step says to isolate the parenthesis. Isolate the parenthesis. So I want to get, isolate means get it by itself. Isolate the parenthesis. So to do that, I'm going to have to add 16 to both sides. And that's going to give me c minus 3 squared equals positive 16. All right. So now what I want to do is now I want to take the parenthesis and do the square root property. So we talked about this. If I take the square root here of this thing, it's going to undo, but I got to take the square root of both sides. But the square root of this whole thing is going to kind of undo that square. It's going to undo that. So you're going to have c minus 3 now. I don't even need that parenthesis, really. C minus 3 equals, well, what's the square root of 16? Well, it actually has 2 answers, remember? Positive, negative 4, because 4 times 4 is 16. Negative 4 times negative 4 is 16. So I got c minus 3 equals a positive negative 4. So really, I have 2 problems here, because I got a positive 4 and a negative 4. So I'm going to have c minus 3 equals 4, and then over here I've got c minus 3 equals the negative 4. Now I'm just solving for c. So I add 3 to both sides, and c equals 7. And over here I add 3 to both sides, and I'd get c equals a negative 1. And those would be my solutions. Okay? If I were to graph this, you'd see it would cross the x-axis at 2 spots, 7 and negative 1. Or if I factored it, I'd probably get solutions of 7 and negative 1. This is just another way of doing it called completing the square. Okay, let's do another one. Let's go to this one here. Just one, I'm going to point something out too that, like I said, it's another way to do this other than factoring and graphing. It's another solution. The only thing that's important is your A value, and I just want to point this out, that if your A value is not 1, you cannot complete the square. So your A value has to be 1. If your A value is 1, then completing the square is an option. If it's not 1, you cannot do that. Okay? So let's try this one, example 5. M squared minus 24m plus 9 equals 0. So we're already equal to 0, so we're in good shape there. The next thing to do is complete the square. So I'm going to take this m squared minus 24m. I'm going to scooch over that plus 9, and then I'm going to set it equal to 0. Remember, I'm going to have a number in here. I'm going to use the parentheses now. And I'm going to have a number in here that I'm adding, and I'm also going to subtract that same number out here. And I'm going to do that by completing the square. Completing the square, I'm going to take my b value, cut it in half. So negative 24 divided by 2 is negative 12. Then I'm going to square that. Negative 12 squared is 144. So now I'm adding 144 inside the parenthesis. I'm subtracting it outside the parenthesis, and I'm ready to roll. Remember what happens here is I should get a factoring shortcut. My variable is m. My half of b value is negative 12 squared. But don't forget this part here, 9 and 144 gives us a negative 135. That's kind of nasty. And an equal to 0. Now looking at the problem, it says here round to the nearest tenth if necessary. So that gives me an idea that, hey, this one's probably not going to work out real nice and neat for an integer, so you're going to probably have to do some rounding. All right, again, now I got to isolate the square root. So I got to get rid of this 135, so I'm going to do that by adding it to both sides. And now I have m minus 12 squared equals a positive 135. The next step is to take the square root of both sides. Square root of this side, square root of this side. All right? Remember, square rooting something that's squared is going to cancel all that out. So I'm going to just be left with m minus 12. And I'm going to have the square root of 135. Well, punch that into your calculator. It doesn't come out equally. And we're going to round to the nearest tenth. So it comes out to a plus or minus 11.6 if you round to the nearest tenth. Remember, you got two answers there because a positive 11.6 squared would be 135. Also, a negative 11.6 squared would be a 135. So I got two different answers here that I got to split up here. So now I'm going to go m minus 12 equals the positive 11.6, and m minus 12 equals the negative 11.6. So just solving two problems. 12. Both of these problems, I'm going to add 12 to both sides. And so my solutions now would be m equals, what is that, 23.6. And this one over here, adding 12 would give me 0.4. And those would be my solutions. You can see that these ones would not cross exactly at a number. These would be the ones that would be between two numbers. These would be two irrational solutions. Okay? All right, that pretty much does it. Let's get to our lesson summary. Talk about after completing the square, explain how, in your own words, to finish the solving. What do you have to do to finish off the problem when you solve? And just explain in your own words. If you need a problem to use this one in your own words. What would you do? And so this one, basically that's what I'm asking you to do is finish solving. X plus 2.5 squared equals 25. Okay? Sorry about all the interruptions in that one, but that's completing the square. We'll talk to you another time.